She spoke fewer than 100 words a year to anyone outside her family. Teachers noticed. Classmates noticed. Nobody knew what to do about it. Then, one afternoon in 2018, at 13 years old, she walked onto the most watched talent stage in the world and sang with the force of a woman twice her age. 310 million people watched, but behind the voice that stopped the world, a girl was quietly disappearing, and the industry that celebrated her loudest was the first to let her fall. Hesleden is not the kind of place that produces global stars. It sits in County Durham on England's northeast coast, a former mining village of tight rows of terraced houses where the pits closed decades ago and the silence they left behind never quite lifted. Paul Hadwin drove a delivery truck. His wife Amory raised their children in that quiet. On July 6, 2004, their daughter Courtney was born into it. She did not thrive in the world outside that house. Teachers at Hesleden Primary School noticed early. Courtney communicated with almost no one she did not already know. According to accounts from family friends and her grandfather Bill, she spoke fewer than 100 words a year to strangers. Not 100 words a week, 100 words a year. She moved through school corridors like someone trying not to be seen. Head down, eye contact avoided, friendships that never quite formed. It was not indifference. The social world simply felt like a language nobody had taught her, and she had no way to begin learning it. What she had instead was a bedroom, a voice, and records that belonged to another era entirely. Tina Turner, Etta James, James Brown, artists born decades before Courtney from a continent she had never visited, singing about lives she had never lived. She copied their phrasing. She matched their runs. She stayed alone and practiced until the sounds stopped being imitation and started being something else, something that was hers alone, even if she could not yet explain how. Her grandfather Bill was the first person outside the house who understood what he was hearing. He spent his entire pension, over £8,000 by documented accounts, driving Courtney to local auditions and theater school sessions across the Northeast. Miles at a time. Weekends given over completely. Her parents took out loans against their home to cover the travel costs. A working-class family from a former mining village, betting everything they had on a child who still couldn't look a stranger in the eye. In April 2015, at 10 years old, Courtney entered a Teen Star competition in Newcastle. She performed Bob Dylan's Make You Feel My Love and reached the grand final. In 2017, she appeared on The Voice Kids UK, auditioning with Tina Turner's Nutbush City Limits, and finished in the top 6. The cameras moved on. The industry did not follow up. But her grandfather had not stopped driving, and Courtney had not stopped practicing. She had the voice of a woman who had lived 3 lifetimes. She was 13 years old and could barely speak to a stranger. Drop it in the comments. Do you think fame helps someone like that, or does it make everything harder? By early 2018, a letter had arrived from America, an invitation to audition for the 13th season of America's Got Talent. The girl who hid in school corridors was about to stand in front of the largest television audience of her life. The AGT production team in Pasadena had seen every kind of audition. Nervous children, overconfident adults, performers who fell apart the moment the lights hit them. What they had not seen, what most people in that building had not seen, was Courtney Hadwin standing in the wings before her audition in the spring of 2018. She was 13 years old. She had her hair hanging over her face. She was wearing a patterned dress that looked like something pulled from a charity shop in County Durham. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was not pacing. She was not warming up. She was standing completely still in the way that very frightened people stand still. Her father, Paul, had spoken to producers beforehand. He told them plainly, his daughter was so shy she had struggled to form friendships her entire childhood, that singing was the only way she knew how to communicate with the world outside her family. He was not offering an excuse. He was offering a warning. Nobody fully heard it. When the judges were introduced to her on camera, she answered their questions in near monosyllables. When Melby asked how she was feeling, Courtney giggled, not the giggle of a relaxed teenager, but the involuntary sound a person makes when a social situation has already exceeded what they can manage. Simon Cowell, asked what she was going to sing. She told him. Howie Mandel asked if she was nervous. She said yes. And then, before anyone could ask anything else, she quietly gestured for the music to start. What happened in the next 3 minutes is documented. It is also, even on a second or third viewing, difficult to fully process. Courtney launched into Otis Redding's Hard to Handle with a voice that did not belong to a 13-year-old, and, as Cowell would put it on air, did not belong to this era at all. She threw her arms wide. She bent at the waist. She stomped across the stage. The voice that came out of her was raw and uncontrolled in the way that only completely controlled performers can sound raw and uncontrolled. The arena rose within 20 seconds. Not politely. All at once. Howie Mandel pressed the golden buzzer. He did it while referencing Clive Davis, the music executive who had discovered Janis Joplin at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival and signed her on the spot. Mandel was not being casual with that comparison. He was saying, I have just witnessed something that does not happen on this kind of stage. Golden confetti fell from the rafters. Courtney stood in the middle of it, weeping. Her father ran from the wings and held her. Cowell's on-air assessment was precise. Bloody hell, Courtney. You're like this shy little thing when you first came out. And then you sing and you're like a lion. The audition clip spread immediately and did not stop. By the time Courtney returned for her first live broadcast, host Tyra Banks announced the video had already passed 200 million views. It would eventually reach 310 million. Overnight, Courtney Hadwin became the most-watched British teenager on the planet. She finished 6th in the season 13 final. 6th, a result that left Cowell visibly dissatisfied on camera. A man who had spent decades in the industry watching talent get mishandled and could see it starting to happen in real time. Shortly after the finale, the offers arrived. Cowell's own label, Psycho Records, distributed through Arista, signed her. She was 14 years old. Her parents signed the contract on her behalf. But here is what no one in that arena paused to examine. Not the judges, not the producers, not the millions watching at home. The quality they were celebrating most loudly was not Courtney's voice. It was the transformation. Shy girl walks out. Lion walks across the stage. Remarkable story. Irresistible television. It was also the description of a child whose only safe place in the world was a performance. What that meant for her, what it would cost her to hand that one safe place to an industry that had no idea what it was holding, was not something anyone in that building was thinking about. But the records would eventually tell a very different story than the one being celebrated that night. The contract arrived with all the language of possibility. Psycho Records, the label Simon Cowell had built into one of the most recognizable imprints in the world, had signed Courtney Hadwin. She was 14. Her parents held the pen. And somewhere in the fine print, the machinery of the industry began its work. What that machinery actually looked like day to day, session to session, Courtney would describe years later in a 2025 interview with Soundsphere magazine. The account she gave was calm. Too calm for what the facts contained. I was in America for about 6 months, she told the magazine, and it was just constant TV stuff. I didn't really like it, but I was persuaded to do AGT Champions as long as I could do an original song. America's Got Talent. The Champions aired in early 2019. Courtney appeared. She performed. She smiled at cameras, the way performers learn to smile when the alternative is not an option. And then she went back to Los Angeles and back into the writing sessions that had been producing nothing useful for months. I spent weeks and weeks being put into writing sessions so they could try to find my sound, she said, but it was always with pop songwriters, which I knew was completely wrong. Read that sentence carefully. A 14-year-old girl, a child who had grown up alone in her bedroom copying Tina Turner, Etta James, and James Brown, knew exactly what she was. The adults in the room did not. Or they did, and decided it did not matter. This pattern is not unusual in the industry. An unconventional talent gets signed, gets celebrated, and then gets quietly redirected toward whatever is easier to sell. Most of the time, the artist is too young or too grateful or too new to push back. The label has the contract. The label has the connections. The label decides what a sound is. What made Courtney's situation distinct was how spectacularly obvious the mismatch was. The voice that had stunned 300 million people was built on soul and rhythm and blues, on singers who sweated through every note and bent every phrase until it bled. The label kept booking sessions with writers who worked in pop. Weeks passed, then months. No album materialized. No release date was set. No single arrived to follow the momentum that had been enormous and was now quietly evaporating. And then Courtney's social media went dark. Her Instagram was wiped clean. The digital trail of her AGT moment, the clips, the comments, the 310 million views, was effectively paused while the label figured out what to do with a product it could not categorize. No explanation was offered publicly. In the meantime, the girl who had briefly been the most talked about teenager on the planet became, online, almost invisible. Then, in the summer of 2020, 2 weeks before her 16th birthday, Courtney Hadwin found out that Psycho Records had shut down operations. She found out the way the general public did, not through a phone call, not through her management, through news reports. The label was gone. The contract was gone. The album promised, postponed, redirected through months of sessions that were wrong from the start, had never been released. She had given 2 years of her adolescence to an institution that dissolved itself and did not think to call her first. It really opened my eyes to the realities of the music industry and who to trust, she said. That sentence is delivered with a composure the facts do not support as natural. She was a child. She had been surrounded by adults who were paid specifically to protect her interests, and she learned her career was over the same way a stranger would have. What most coverage of this period leaves out is the additional weight that had been pressing down alongside the professional failure. The Janis Joplin comparison, made with such visible excitement by Howie Mandel on that AGT stage, had not faded. Music journalists kept returning to it. Online commentators built their entire frameworks for Courtney around it. She was Joplin's heir. She was the next great rock voice. She was walking the same path. Janis Joplin died at 27, destroyed by addiction, consumed by an industry that celebrated her loudly and protected her not at all. For a teenager already managing severe social anxiety, the cultural weight of being publicly framed as the successor to a woman who burned out and died young was not a tribute. It was a frame she had no way of removing, applied constantly by people who thought they were paying her a compliment. What happened after the label collapsed, what Courtney carried alone through the next 2 years, is the part of this story most people never heard. And if you want to make sure you don't miss stories told this way, subscribe right now. Because this is where it gets complicated. By the time the pandemic arrived and the world locked down, Courtney Hadwin was 16 years old. No label, no released album, no tour dates, and without a stage, the one place on earth where she had ever felt fully safe, she had nothing left to move toward. If you have ever worked yourself to the edge of everything you had, handed it to someone, and watched them treat it like it meant nothing, you already know exactly what Courtney was feeling in 2020. The pandemic did not create her collapse. It removed the last distraction from it. With live performance canceled, recording sessions gone, and the label that had consumed 2 years of her life now shuttered, there was nothing left to move toward. No audition to prepare for. No flight to book. No session to sit through. Just a terraced house in County Durham and the sound of a world that had briefly made her famous, and then simply moved on. What followed is documented in accounts from family sources and reporting by citynews68.com. Courtney developed agoraphobia. For approximately 3 months, she could not leave her house. Not the reluctance of someone who preferred to stay in. Not a quiet patch of low energy. A full contraction where the panic that had always lived inside her expanded to fill every room she was in. Most accounts of Courtney Hadwin's story either end here or look away entirely. What they tend not to report is that the psychological pattern described here has a name, even if no one was using it at the time. A teenager with debilitating social anxiety, whose only reliable mechanism for regulating her emotional world was performance, had lost access to performing. Mental health researchers describe what happens in situations like this as a compounding trauma response, where the removal of the one coping tool a person relies on doesn't simply leave them without comfort. It destabilizes everything that tool was holding together. Stage fright, for most performers, is the fear of the stage. For Courtney, the stage had been the cure. Losing access to it was the sickness. She was 16 years old. No label. No manager with a plan. No publicly documented support structure of any kind. She had the people who had always been there, her family, her grandfather Bill, who had spent his pension driving her to auditions, and she had a bedroom that now felt like the only safe place in a world that had closed down to a single house. She began writing, not for a label, not for a session, for herself, quietly, the way she had always found music before anyone was paying attention. That was the only version of Courtney Hadwin that had ever been entirely real. But before she could finish what she was building, something else arrived. In early 2025, Courtney suffered a vocal hemorrhage, a rupture of blood vessels in the vocal cords that required months of enforced total silence. No singing. No speaking beyond what was medically necessary. Complete vocal rest. For most performers, this is a frightening setback. For Courtney, it was something closer to an existential threat. Her voice was not just her career. It was the mechanism through which she had ever made real contact with the world outside her own head. The thing she had been doing alone in her bedroom since childhood, before any talent show, before any label, before anyone was watching. Taking it away was not a pause in her work. It was the removal of the one tool she had used to survive everything that had happened to her. The enforced silence also triggered something uglier. Rumors spread across social media that Courtney Hadwin had died in a car crash. Entirely fabricated. No factual basis. But they spread far enough that her team was forced to publicly address them. A young woman in the middle of a medical crisis that had taken her voice recovered to find the internet actively debating whether she was still alive. She was, and she was still writing. Through the label collapse, the agoraphobia, the hemorrhage, and the false death rumors, through 4 years of accumulating losses that would have ended most careers before they began, Courtney Hadwin did not disappear. She recorded independently. She kept going without a contract to honor or a release date to aim for, because stopping was never something she had learned how to do. By late 2024, something had shifted. A debut album was finally taking shape, not in a label's writing room with pop songwriters who did not understand her, but entirely in her own hands. She had chosen the title herself. It said everything about what the years had actually made her. It was called Little Miss Jagged. Little Miss Jagged was not a comeback. Courtney Hadwin did not frame it that way, and the word does not fit. A comeback implies a return to something. Courtney was not returning to the version of herself that AGT had produced, the 13-year-old phenomenon position for pop crossover built for mass consumption, compared to a dead woman before she was old enough to drive. She was not going back to any of that. She was going somewhere she had never been allowed to go. The album arrived in 2025. She had written it herself. She released it independently, with no label deciding what her sound was supposed to be, and no songwriter in the room working in a genre she had never belonged to. The title was chosen deliberately, not polished, not aspirational, not the thing the industry had spent 2 years trying to make her into. Jagged, uneven, sharp at the edges, a word that names what you become when enough pressure has been applied and you refuse to smooth yourself down to make other people comfortable. Her debut single, the pop-punk track Spellbound, arrived in early 2025 with a full video. It sounded nothing like what the Psycho Sessions had tried to build. That was the point. By 2026, her first UK headline tour had sold out. The girl who had spent her entire childhood hiding in school corridors was now filling venues on the strength of music she had written from her own life. Not from a talent show appearance, not from a golden buzzer and 310 million views. From the years that came after. The label that